Well, there we are in the southeast, and as the night drives on, it still seems to be a bit indecisive. Scottish nationalist there, Gordon Wilson, who's our expert on oil, taking Dundee East, although they've also had bad news. They've lost Glasgow Govan. We'll go into that in a moment. Let's have a little look at some results from London. Here we are, and no great surprises.
The London swing is about 2%, and those are all just about the average.
Marcus Lipton back in Lambeth Central.
All about 20% vote for the Liberals.
And Tunbridge and Malling, this is a new seat, but it would have been surprising if the Conservatives hadn't taken it.
The Liberals are second with 27% of the vote. National turnout is up by about 8% overall, and they're 10%.
Well, we've seen these before, but we always like to confirm them for you. All right, that's the situation then in the southeast. No great surprises there, but there's been a night of some ups and downs for all the parties. They all have perhaps the odd wound to show. The Liberals perhaps at Sutton and Cheam, and the Tories holding on here and there in Uxbridge, where they might otherwise have thought, and indeed in Upminster, a little bit of surprise there, David, that they should hold on to these seats. This is a very ragged election, isn't it, in many ways?
Well, in some ways, and yet when I look at the actual regional pattern, it really is extraordinarily uniform. The swing in virtually every area is about the same. Scotland seems to be rather, we've got 16 results in from Scotland, we haven't shown them all, a slight swing to the Conservatives, perhaps by the Nationalists cutting into the Labour vote, and in Wales a slight swing to the Conservatives, particularly in marginal seats. I think they are holding on to those two ones in Cardiff North that they might well have worried about.
Now, is this organisation, do you think, in some of these marginals?
No, I don't really believe it's organisation. I think it's mainly a response to the national issues in a different way. I mean, life is different. You've got the nationalist vote cutting in, the different problems of the south, of Wales and Scotland and the southwest. They don't feel part of the great central English belt. Actually, it's the West Midlands that is the other deviant one. That's a high swing, and 9 of Labour's 23 gains are in the West Midlands.
Well, there's Enoch, and he'll be sitting in Eaton Square tonight saying he's responsible. So, there we are, but there's many more results to come, and we don't know the answer. And at the present situation, the Labour lead over the Conservative, you can see it ticking over there, 62, but with 326 results to come. And a predicted overall winner is still at the moment beyond our computer's capability. I think we should have a little look now at some results, particularly some interesting results from Scotland, which not everybody will have heard of. Here is Gordon Wilson, senior vice president of the Scottish National Party. They're oil experts, taking Dundee East. Mr. Machin was rather a left-wing Labour candidate, and Mr. Gourley ran against him for that reason.
Mr. Wilson gets nearly 40% of the vote. That's 14% up on the by-election and 30% up on the last general election.
And here's Dudley East. This is a Labour success again in the Midlands.
The second highest swing we've had tonight, 11.4%, next door to Wolverhampton, where there was a 16% in Enoch Powell's seat.
And here are the Conservatives holding this seat in Cardiff North West. I think they expected to take it, but they've taken it comfortably.
And a swing of 4% to the Conservatives. Then when the word isn't mentioned after swing, it means it's to the Conservatives. And that means the recount in Cardiff North must leave the Conservatives gaining a seat there.
And here we have George Younger, who has been one of the promising junior ministers there in the Scottish office, holding on to it. It used to be quite marginal, but it's going his way.
Slight swing to the Conservatives there, and the Scottish Nationalist loses his deposit with just under 12% of the vote.
Worry for the Scot Nats because they've lost Govan. Nottingham and East here, Jack Dunnett, of course, football director and Labour member. He's doing all right.
2.5% swing to the Labour Party. The swing is much less in the East Midlands than the West Midlands. I really begin to think we can talk about Powell country.
Well, now, just a word, I think, about the Scottish Nationalists, David. They have taken this seat in Dundee East, which they had high hopes of. And again, we must correct. There's Conservatives, Mr. Fletcher holding Edinburgh North, which he took at the by-election. We must correct that incorrect impression we gave about the result in Murray and Nairn, just to say all is still to play for there. But they must be disappointed that Margot MacDonald, who is very much their sort of glamour girl, has failed to hold government.
And Labour's held Glasgow Kelvingrove while we're talking. Other figures I've seen in Motherwell, a 20% nationalist vote, you know, quite respectably large votes. But I think Dundee is a legacy thing. Here's the Motherwell result, I was just speaking of.
George Lawson.
20% of the vote for the Scottish nationalist, but George Lawson comfortably back, though there's a swing to the Conservatives there.
And I think we have Plaid Cymru's second success on the way, taking Carnarvon. But here's Glasgow Shettleston. That's Sir Maher Galpin, of course, the former Lord Provost of Glasgow, used to get a knighthood or indeed a baronetcy in the old days.
A very slight swing to Labour, but net, the swing in Scotland is to the Conservatives, not to Labour.
And perhaps this is the SNP's influence. But we're waiting. There is the Plaid Cymru taking Carnarvon, so that's 2 down, and perhaps one of their big hopes still to come.
Well, that was, yes, Carnarvon was their best hope. If after they'd won Meirionydd, they'd have been very disappointed not to take Carnarvon. That's Goronwy Roberts defeated in Carnarvon, a former minister at the Foreign Office.
But this, of course, must complicate the question of government forming and coalition forming, with nationalists beginning to come into the picture, with the Scottish nationalists taking in Dundee East, 2 Welsh nationalists, Labour, however, taking Preston North to set beside their gain in Preston South. Well, now Robin Day is talking to 2 prominent party members in Leeds, Sir Keith Joseph for Leeds North West and Mr Dennis Healey for Labour.
Good morning. Gentlemen, knowing that half the seats are still to come, the computer suggests a small Labour majority over the Conservatives, and
make your mind up. Awkward.
If I may just continue, the Labour majority on our computer prediction is 5, and the Liberals have got 13, and the Labour 306, Conservatives 301. Now, we know this can change, but Mr Healey, how do you view the possibility, at any rate, of a Labour minority government?
I don't look at it at all. I think the computer's as unreliable as the polls were, and I'm still pretty confident that we shall have an adequate majority.
But supposing it were to happen, you as a probable Chancellor of the Exchequer, it's not the ideal parliamentary background to tackling our economic difficulties, is it?
Of course it isn't, but nothing I say now is going to influence the result, and I'd be daft if I discussed a hypothesis which you put forward, which I don't believe in.
Well, it's because of nothing you say can influence it that I thought you might be prepared to say it.
I know, quite the reverse. I'm concerned now with the problems I may be facing in 24 hours' time.
Yeah. Sir Keith, are you disappointed?
Provisionally disappointed, but I think there may be surprises yet during the night. I'm not prepared to accept these predictions. There are all sorts of surprises to come, I reckon.
And why do you think that Mr Heath has obviously, whatever the result, he's obviously not got his new mandate to give him the new situation for the solution of the industrial disputes and the conduct of the economy, has he?
I think it's certainly very sad for the country if there isn't a decisive majority for a government.
What do you think about that, Mr Healey? Do you think it is sad if there's not a decisive decision?
It would be a great pity. I think the one thing that's already certain is that Mr Heath made a quite disastrous miscalculation. If in fact there was an indecisive result from the general election, I think that history will blame him, because I think the problems faced by whoever forms the next government would perhaps be very, very difficult to deal with. But as I said earlier, I myself believe that we shall have a decisive result, and I certainly hope so.
One more question, gentlemen. Whatever the result, is there not a message to both of you, or rather to both your parties, in the Liberal increase? Mr Healey?
I think there's a message, yes. I think that it shows that for quite a period during the general election, people felt that the election was a beauty contest rather than the choice of a team to get the country out of the mess it's in. But it was quite clear by the end of the campaign that people were beginning to realise how serious the problem was, and that it was not a question of choosing a pop star, but a question of choosing people with the determination and experience and energy to get the country out of the mess.
Thank you, Mr Healey and Sir Keith Joseph in Leeds. Now may I turn to our 3 political journalists who were with us earlier. Peter Jenkins of The Guardian, Anthony Hard of The New Statesman, and Patrick Cosgrave of The Spectator. And I want to turn to Patrick Cosgrave first, because he was on the midweek programme last Saturday and almost alone was predicting a Labour victory against the polls.
Well, obviously on these figures one is pleased to find that one's judgment throughout has been borne out. I have never thought it remotely possible that the Conservative Party under Mr Heath could win a general election held this year. I still think that as the computer goes on recording results this evening, we will gradually see the emergence of a Labour majority. But my two tips have always been either a Labour majority or a minority government. I've never thought a Conservative win remotely possible.
Anthony Hart, how do you see the evening so far?
Well, I think it looks to me more likely that it will be a minority government than an effective Labour working majority, and I'm sorry about that. But I agree with Patrick, it's not only against the polls. You know, I've sat here tonight really taking some comfort from the fact that with very, very few exceptions, the IPC papers, my own paper, The New Statesman, every single battery of assault was brought to bear on the electorate, telling them they had to elect Mr Heath. And I'm delighted when the press gets a bloody nose, and it gives me great comfort to see it really with a good deal of blood all over its face tonight.
Do you think that the people are giving you a bloody nose because you said not long ago that Mr Wilson has sunk to a position where his very presence in Labour's leadership pollutes the atmosphere of politics?
I think that's a perfectly fair question. I think I have to say quite plainly that if Mr Wilson had not been leader of the Labour Party, I think we might more easily have seen an effective Labour majority. But I'm delighted if he's going to be Prime Minister.
I think that Harold Wilson came out and fought a really cracking campaign, and you know, he must be given the credit for the fact that Labour has closed the gap against the odds. What I think is absolutely fascinating about this election is that it is almost as if the voters have said, let us have a dead heat, and they have to be very clever and very cunning to achieve that result. But you've seen it in the way in which the Liberal vote has been very large, but particularly in stronghold seats on one side or the other, and in the marginals it's been much closer.
Well, thank you, gentlemen. We look forward to hearing from you again. Alistair?
And the computer is beginning, I think, to settle down with half the results in now, beginning to settle down to what looks like a deadlock situation. Some interesting results while we were talking there. Well, let's get these out of the way first. No very great surprise there, except in Northampton South, the Conservatives have taken that marginal seat. That means the unfortunate Mr John Dilks, who was beaten by Mr Dick de Verne in Lincoln, has failed again to get into Parliament.
We reckon that a slight swing for the Conservatives.
And there we have some seats good for Labour there, both Bradford West and Dartford.
But in fact, hardly any swing in any of them.
Again, there, no particular surprise.
Eric Moonman back in the old part of the old Billericay seat.
In Conway there, the Conservative has put up his majority quite substantially.
It must be a great relief to them to hold Conway and to hold Southampton Test. The Conservatives done very well in Wales.
Here's one which is important. Mrs Judith Hart, who would have lost a seat in 1970 as it's now constituted, has retained what is now almost a county seat in Lanark. She lost the best piece of it to East Kilbride.
We're not quite sure about the 1970 calculations. It's guess what would happen then.
And here's Carnarvon, the success of Mr David Wigley, who is an industrial economist and the second Plaid Cymru gain of the night.
His vote jumps 7%. He got the best share of the vote of any Plaid Cymru candidate last time. It's a very impressive result, though.
And here's Labour taking the second seat in Preston.
They have done well in that part of Lancashire.
I think they've got another success coming up from Brighouse and Spenborough. Here's Hampstead, however, Mr Finsberg, who's really on the pro-Israeli side of the Conservative Party, but one of their bright young men.
That swing is to the Conservatives. 2% swing to the Conservatives against the tide in Hampstead.
Manchester Marseille, this is one the Conservatives would have expected to lose through the boundary commissioners as much as anything else.
But still, there was quite a big movement there, a 3% swing to Labour, we think. 22% of the vote for the Liberal.
Now we have Mr Charles Morrison back in Devizes and Mr Paul Dean in Somerset
But
North.
a very impressive Liberal vote in Devizes, which might mean that Chippenham would be in danger next door.
And we, with the news that there's a recount at Aldridge and Brown Hills, that's Pat Hornsby-Smith's new seat up there in the Midlands, although, of course, her old seat was actually held by the Conservatives. Let's have another word now. We've had so many controversies. Well, now, Graham, what's the latest from the front?
Well, we've over half the results in now, and here are the predictions. Conservatives 300, Labour 307, Liberals 13, and other parties also about 13. The figure of 307 means that the Labour Party are expected to be 11 short of the 318 seats needed to form a government. The computer predicts that the most likely result of this election is that the Liberals and other parties will hold the balance.
I don't know whether that's good news for anybody or not. We'll go now to Brentford and Isleworth, where there's a very closely fought seat in West London.
Well, we're all waiting for the result here, which we're expecting to be declared at any minute now. This, as has already been said this evening, is a new constituency where we've got the intriguing situation of having two sitting MPs fighting over a new seat. At the moment, the returning officer, Councillor Raymond Padley, is up here on the stage. He's the Mayor of Hounslow, and we're expecting him to declare the result at any moment. This is a constituency in which the issues haven't really been fought on the national policies. Both the candidates here are moderates. The Tory candidate is Barney Hayhoe, and Michael Barnes is the Labour candidate. And they're both pro-European, and they're both moderates on such issues as immigration. And
well, that is, of course, an interesting seat there. Two sitting members and fighting it out toe-to-toe. I think, actually, before we have any more results, although we have a fair number, since we are really, I think, sticking in this minority government situation, I wonder, Robert Mackenzie, whether you've got any particular thoughts about this. Supposing this was the result that the Queen faces, and she calls Mr. Heath to ask his advice, as I think she will be bound to do when she returns to London. What's your view on this?
Well, of course, he has every right to meet Parliament and to be defeated, or to find out whether the Liberals might be prepared to sustain him. But assuming either that he carried on in a minority government or Labour formed a minority government, there's going to be a terrible tendency abroad and in some quarters in this country to treat this as the end of the world. Now, in fact, Mrs. Mayer is ruling without a majority in Israel. The Swedish government doesn't have a majority in Parliament, and it has to depend effectively on some communist MPs. Canada has most of the time, in the last 15 years, had minority governments. Lester Pearson was Prime Minister, a distinguished Prime Minister, never had a majority, nor did he form a coalition.
But I think one of the points, Bob, is do they actually have the kind of precarious financial position that most British governments have had to face in recent years?
Well, they have another kind of precarious situation in Israel. I mean, so that I think while one would like to have seen a clear majority, and hopefully even yet see one, for either major party, now it seems to be important to steel our nerves and not assume that the end of the world follows. And of course, if you look at coalitions, if that were on the cards, most governments in Europe are coalitions, simply because no one party gets a majority.
And I think one of the problems about this is because we are unused to coalitions in Britain. We had them in the 1920s, but every party, the Labour and Conservative Party, have done their best to avoid one. I think Mr. Wilson in 64, 66 is damnedest to avoid having any such thing.
It's very curious because
we may be very slow in forming one, and that could be quite ruinous financially.
Well, but it's very curious that there should be an idea in this country that you can't be a socialist and have a coalition with anybody to your right. I mean, Brandt came to power by a coalition first with the Conservatives, then with the Liberals in Germany.
Well, the coalition is going to mean some people have got to eat their words, because after all, Jeremy Thorpe said he won't serve under either Harold Wilson or Ted Heath,
well,
which makes a pretty deadlocked situation.
Words too seriously.
Well, I don't know.
In the national interest, we may have to have a coalition, that's
But you see, but again, supposing there is a coalition government, Bob, and supposing it even does as well as plainly you think it might be able to do, I think most people would actually say this result suggests that there's going to be another general election within the next year and a half.
But even that's not inevitable. In other words, we have long periods of minority government in many parts of the world, and it simply the onus is placed upon the third party not to force an immediate election. And they usually are very careful to abide by that.
Disraeli said England does not love coalitions.
Well,
I'm not advocating one, but I'm saying neither minority government nor coalition ought to be out of the question for strong government.
Well, perhaps we need to take a leaf out of his book. Of course, it was Mr. Baldwin and Mr. Ramsay MacDonald who were the last practitioners of this kind of very difficult situation. We know we're in a difficult situation because there's a third recount at Peterborough. When things are really difficult, they go up to 6 or 7 recounts at Peterborough.
They did, a majority of 3 in 1966.
Well, let's see some more results. And here we are down to the east of London. Sir Bernard Brain there, back.
Liberals all around 20, 23, 24% in this area, just not making the breakthrough. They are just below the breakthrough point.
And back to the Midlands, this time the East Midlands.
Nothing unexpected in those, though the swing is slightly higher than we've having these. Except Nottingham West, that swing is to the Conservatives against Michael English, so the seat has been much redistributed.
And now down to the 2 cities in South Wales.
And South Wales, the swing is to the Conservatives in Cardiff West and Swansea East. No swing in Swansea West. But
George
Wales
Thomas
is outside the pattern. George Thomas back.
George Thomas, the name now. And here we are, getting back up into the Midlands again, but I don't think there's any real surprises.
But you notice a much bigger swing in Coventry in West Midlands than in Bassetlaw or Wellingborough in the East Midlands.
Here we are, Mr. Malloy back in Ealing North.
This must please them very much. It does represent a big swing to Labour, about a 3%, 3.5% swing to Labour in a seat that would have been Conservative thanks to redistribution.
And this is the result in
we've
Manchester
seen this
Moss
before,
side. We
yes.
have indeed, but it's always nice to see it again, even though you may be the Marxist-Leninist candidate and you only got 206 seats, 206 votes. And here's the Conservatives holding Cardiff North quite safely.
Upset people beginning by saying there was a recount there. I don't know why there should be a recount on those votes.
Is the Liberal saving a deposit?
No, the Liberal did very well. He got 20% of the vote.
Here's one of the Conservatives' successes in West London, Sir George Young.
But that's thanks to redistribution. Mr. Spearing was bound to lose on those redistribution. There was actually a slight swing to Labour.
And now in Pembroke, oh, we haven't got the Pembroke result, but just to say there, the Conservatives have held Pembroke.
Right against the tide. They were all thought certain to lose it.
Mr. Nick Edwards there, who took it because it was Desmond Donnelly who was fighting his old seat against Labour, so there were 2 Labour candidates last time. Nicholas Edwards squeaked through and took it, and he's held it this time.
Yes, well, it is this swing in Wales. Labour has lost 2 seats to Plaid Cymru and gained nothing of the seats it hoped to gain from the Conservatives.
Alex Lyon back in York there. Used to be marginal in the old days, but not since he's been sitting there. Let's look at that Pembroke result. And there we are with, in fact, Plaid Cymru doing extremely badly and losing a deposit.
Well, you don't expect English. It's called English Wales. They don't speak Welsh in most of Pembrokeshire.
Oh, well, we're not going to forecast any civil war. More results here. Here's Mr. Colin Jackson coming back again. Of course, he is Fort Brighouse and Spenborough, who's a member for 64 to 70. Then Mr. Wilfred Proudfoot took it, and now Mr. Proudfoot is down.
It's accustomed to recounts. It had the narrowest majority in 1959, 55, I think.
And, of course, here's John Selwyn Gummer, who's one of the Conservatives' bright young men, indeed a deputy chairman of the party looking after youth. He's lost his seat in Lewisham West.
He was worried about losing it because of the Liberal vote there.
Well, we'll get the fuller figures about Lewisham West, but that, of course, is a familiar figure on the platform of Conservative Party conferences, one of the young men who's come to the top, and he's failed there this time in Lewisham West. Labour there winning Bristol North East.
Made safe for Labour by redistribution.
Well, what we're waiting now is for some great stroke coming down from Mount Olympus, which may save the parties. I think the Conservatives and Labour would like to be saved from actually having a minority government or a coalition government, despite what Robert Mackenzie said. Labour holding Gateshead East. They'd be surprised indeed if they had lost that particular one.
We've got another 90 seats to come tonight, so there's still quite a lot to play for. But of course we haven't heard from agricultural seats in the sort of places where the Liberals might specially hope to do well, down in the West Country, for example. And we haven't heard very much from Scotland, and certainly rural Scotland.
A little look at the state of the parties now and how we stand, with Labour, of course, clearly ahead at this stage of the night and their gains beginning to show up. Perhaps the little surprise there that there are only, in fact, 3 Liberal gains so far tonight. Here's the full result in Preston North, Labour taking that seat and regaining control over both parts of the town.
Both of them with a 4% swing.
You plainly have to live on a knife edge there in that situation. Well now, Bob, what do you think is likely to turn up tonight which could in fact stop a minority government happening in Britain?
Well, there's one point I'd like to make is we worked out earlier that the Labour Party needed to be 72 seats ahead of the Conservatives by the time we went off the air tonight, or 70 approximately. They're 70 seats ahead at the moment. Now, if they can hold that 70-seat lead they've got at the moment, 72 there, they probably have guaranteed the destruction of the Heath majority. They will not, however, they'll be quite a long way still from a working majority, and indeed it's entirely likely that the combination of the Liberals, the Scottish Nationalists, Welsh Nationalists, Northern Ireland Independents of various kinds, together will hold the balance of power. It's not inevitable, but quite likely on present form. And that raises problems that everybody ought to be thinking about.
We've been accustomed to a three-party parliament. We're going to have about a seven-party parliament. With all the Northern Ireland species, we might have a 9- or 10-party parliament
this time. That's exactly the kind of parliament in Europe which leads to either minority government or coalition.
Well, and of course, but this is a very different situation, I think, with the Northern Ireland point, which David has made, with people shouting that it's Scotland's oil. After all, I think a lot of politicians in the south here in England felt that if they could win this election, they were liable to stay in power for a long time because of North Sea oil. But it's all still to play for. Here's Lewisham West, and here's Mr. Chris Price, who was Labour MP for Birmingham Perry Bar from 1960 to 70, coming back here. He's a journalist now, former teacher, and Mr. John Selwyn Gummer going down. And I suspect he'll bounce back somewhere.
The Liberals only got 16% of the vote there.
And, well now, with those results, Robin Day is talking to, I imagine, two slightly disappointed Liberals in Liverpool. Robin.
And with me in Liverpool are Mr. Cyril Carr, former chairman of the Liberal Party, and Mr. Trevor Jones, former president of the Liberal Party. And gentlemen, you both came third. Now, what happened to Jones the vote? Now, I can't hear. Sorry, I can't hear you, Mr. Jones. It's not your fault, because I could see that you're speaking, and I'll go back to Alistair and we'll come and pick you up later. My apologies.
Well, that's rather bad luck. It's the kind of moment when you really do want to have an explanation ready. There's news for the Conservatives that Tom Iremonger has held Ilford North after a recount. Yet another example of how, although there is a clear swing to the Labour Party, the Tories are resisting, and indeed perhaps it's their resistance which is deadlocking the present situation. While we're waiting to go back to Liverpool, a look at one or two results. Sheffield-Heeley, and we've made that joke about Mr. Hooley before, but it's still quite a good one.
17% of the vote for the Liberals.
And here's Birmingham Erdington. Not much of a sensation there. National Front has been running badly tonight.
Turnout up 8% as it is nationally. It really is a picture of greater involvement in the election.
Here's Robert Redmond, who's a former agent who actually made it to MP for the Conservatives, and he has held on to Bolton West, though East has gone to Labour.
Bolton had record swings last time. Here's a very low one.
Well, now Mr. Wilson is at Huyton. Of course, his count is over. He's successfully in. You will have seen him earlier tonight. Perhaps you'll have looked at his face and at Mrs. Wilson's face, the pride in her face, and yet perhaps also the thought, is she going to go back to number 10?
Where he comes after every poll in every general election. If you missed it, and I'm not sure whether you did, he's had a tremendous reception here as he came in from a very excited and enthusiastic audience.
The proudest time with the usual heightened response, because obviously, in view of the manner and the way in which the news is travelling at the moment, it is important that both Harold and Mary are able to get away within a reasonable time.
We now know that Mr. Wilson is going to spend the night up here in Liverpool. He'll be travelling down to London tomorrow. This is one of his party workers introducing him here. You can see Mrs. Wilson, who's not been well the last 2 days or so of the campaign, shouts of Prime Minister to him, Prime Minister, they're all calling out.
Mr. Chairman, and Peter, and Arthur. Where is Arthur? Get him up here.
Oh, get him up. Arthur Smith, come on, Arthur.
And friends. I haven't got much voice left after this campaign. I need your help. Now then, you're not helping. It seems to me that you look a bit more cheerful than you did on the night of June the 18th, 1970. I don't understand why. On that occasion, I had a majority here of 21,000, and it's only 15,000 tonight. It might be because we've got a smaller constituency. But the result in Huyton, I think, is one of the most remarkable in the country. And I want to thank all of you for it. I didn't say that at the count. I didn't want to, rub it in at all, but... And I thought they were going to give me the chance of speaking outside the hall, but they didn't. There was no microphone. But I cannot claim any credit for this wonderful result in Huyton. It's all yours. I wasn't even here. I wasn't even here. You did all the work. So I can't claim any credit. The credit is all yours. And I want to thank all those who've played a great part in this in every part of the constituency. Above all, I want to praise Arthur. We knew that we must expect a reduction in our majority. Arthur, who's a cautious fellow, told me our majority would be 8,000. You nearly doubled it between you. And you mustn't worry about losing Kirby, because by handing over Kirby to Ormskirk, we have won Ormskirk. And you carried the burden of losing Kirby. By the way, if you can stand any more shocks, we've won Garston. And I'll be surprised if we haven't won Bebington, but we haven't heard the news yet. Have we? What have we done? I'm very glad about that. I went to school in Bebington. Now then, I'm not going to say anything tonight about the national position. The results are still coming through. Many of them are reasonably encouraging. I'm very glad that in this election, considering how it was called and the excuse given, that my agent in this constituency was a former miner at Cronton.
We never got any coal anyway. We never got any coal.
And whatever government is formed as a result of this election, whatever party it might be, its first job must be to get the miners back to work. And its second job must be to get you all back to work instead of the 3-day week. I have a feeling you're not going to be in much condition for work tomorrow morning. Anyhow, thank you again. Whatever little job I might have to be doing in the next year or two, I shall be up here regularly. We'll have a celebration. And to our friends from Prescott, let me say this. I shall fulfill the engagement next Friday to speak at the annual dinner of the Prescott Party. It would be wrong for me to mention any of the local parties who have done so much in this campaign, or any individuals, but we have given in recent years a very special welcome to Cantrill Farm. They worked hard. They have been comrades in every sense of the word, and they played the fullest possible part in this victory and in helping to offset the loss of Kirby. Thank you again all. And whether tomorrow I shall be found to be leading the party with the biggest number of seats, or the official leader of the opposition, or the leader of the party with the third biggest number of seats. Whichever it is, I shall continue to serve Huyton to the full extent of my ability. Thank you.
Mr. Wilson talking about the little job that he may or indeed may not have in a week's time. But this is a very remarkable result, and one which must cause considerable worry to all the senior politicians. Well, now Mr. Heath is back in Downing Street. He arrived there tonight, possibly for the last time, but of course it's his privilege. It's up to him to know what he intends to do. Here is the man who had hoped to be returned tonight with a governable majority, a majority over all parties. It doesn't look as if that's going to happen, although, of course, the election is not over yet. Mr. Heath going back to number 10, and it's for him, I think, to make the first move. The Queen was back in the morning, and she will want to know what the result of the election is, and she will, of course, have to be in consultation with the party leaders to take the advice of the outgoing party leader, if that is Mr. Heath's fate. And indeed, of course, it's been known in the 1920s for a defeated leader to meet the House of Commons in the belief that one or other of the two parties facing him would not throw him out. And Mr. Heath may suppose that if Europe, for example, was the main issue in the election, then would the Liberals vote against him on Europe? This is where the problem comes. Well, Bob?
Alistair, you know, all along I've been worried by the doomsday approach to this election, which some journals, it seems to me, have rather promoted, and danger, too, that people, the world, would take too literally Mr. Heath's definition of the issue, that it's conservatism or extremism and chaos. And now, it would be very difficult if there is a minority government of either side, but I do think it's terribly important that people should realize that the inner core of an incoming Labour government cannot fairly be labelled as extremist. It will not be that sort of thing at all. Otherwise, there will be a great panic tomorrow on the stock exchanges, internationally, on the currency markets, everything else. And this is what worries me most about an indeterminate result tonight, the effect tomorrow and thereafter.
Well, what struck me about the election has been such an extraordinarily moderate election of a moderate people talking in moderate terms, and whatever government is there will be behaving moderately.
And they have produced the kind of parliament that most other countries have, a divided parliament.
That's not always the most successful way of doing it. We're going now to Cardiganshire for the declaration.
Returning officer here is Mr. Gareth Royal Rees, the High Sheriff of Cardigan. He's a farmer. There have been 4 candidates here: Liberal, Plaid Cymru, Conservative and Labour. Here comes the result.
Etholiad Seneddol, Etholaeth Ceredigion.
Ceredigion, Cardigan.
Sydd am henw isod, y swyddog canlyniadau weithredol dros Etholaeth Ceredigion, drwy hyn yn ysbysu fod cyfanrif y pleidleisiau a fwrwyd dros bob ymgeisydd yn yr etholiad fel y ganlyn. Clifford Gregory Davies, Plaid Cymru.
Welsh Nationalist Party.
4,700 54. Geraint Wyn Howells, Plaid Prydfrydol, 4,010,
14,000.
Trevor Wilmot Llywelyn,
That's the Liberal.
758. David Liston Morgan.
This the sitting member, Mr. Alasdair Morgan, Labour.
1,010.
11,895 in English. That means that the seat has fallen to the Liberal. This is a Liberal gain from Labour in Cardigan. There's the new member, Mr. Geraint Howells, a farmer who farms about 12 miles up into the hills of Cardiganshire. Liberal gain at Cardigan.
Ladies and gentlemen, I shall now do it in English.
Well, this was a seat that had been Liberal for 80 years until 1966. Mr. Morgan came in. He's now been defeated by a local farmer who has very well known all through the constituency. The Liberals had great hopes of this seat, and Roddy Bowen's old seat has gone back to the Liberals. But my Welsh didn't enable me to get the figures or give you any percentages.
What's the Welsh for swing, David?
Welsh for swing? No, I'm not. Dim Cymraeg, that's my Welsh. No Welsh, that's what
I
I'm
only
saying.
know that name of that railway station in North Wales, but anyhow, this is quite a night, of course, and a number of very remarkable results indeed. You've seen there how Labour has taken Middleton and Prestwich after a recount, and of course the Conservatives holding Dover and Deal, and indeed Brentford and Isleworth. Well, now, we had to interrupt our talk to the Liberals in Liverpool because of a little sound failure, but I think we've restored communication. Robin.
And we're back with Mr. Cyril Carr, former chairman of the Liberal Party, and who is in Liverpool Wavertree, and Mr. Trevor Jones, former president of the Liberal Party, and who is in Liverpool Toxteth. And first of all, gentlemen, I won't put my original question. I will be more up to date and say, what do you think about the Cardigan result?
We are delighted.
Tell us about Mr. Geraint Howells.
Well, Geraint, I remember going to Brussels with him. I got to know him quite well. We went to see the European commissioners, and he will be a great asset to the House of Commons.
Well, now, you've had 3 gains, Isle of Wight, Hazel Grove and Cardigan, and if you call Rochdale a gain as regards the last election, how do you feel about the Liberals so far with 18.5% of the vote after 385 seats declared?
Well, I feel that we're going to get about 5 million votes and maybe 15 seats. And I think the country will agree with me that if that is so, it will be a disgraceful reflection of the Liberal presence in this country, but it may be there'll be a rough justice in that the Liberal Party will have the balance of power and will have a great say in helping to solve the tremendous problems that face the country.
Mr. Jones, what happened to Jones the vote in your constituency?
Well, he lost, didn't he?
Yeah, didn't do very well.
Well, let's face it, we had a 3-week campaign, Robin.
Yes.
And we had a constituency in which we had one half held by the Liberal Party and the other half without any Liberal presence whatever. And we got, as a seat we hadn't fought since 1950. And I think we got a creditable result. Obviously, we're disappointed. We like to win. There's no such thing as a good second place in my book. And I think what's happened, really, is that the party woke up to the fact that the country was fed up with the other parties. It woke up to the fact far too late.
Now, Mr. Carr has just spoken of the balance of power in Liberal hands being a kind of rough justice for the Liberals. But is it good for the country? Do you think in its very serious economic situation to have a kind of government which might be unstable, despite Mr. Robert Mackenzie's enthusiasm for foreign-type coalitions?
No, I don't think it's not going to be unfavourable to the country at all. I think the Liberals will exercise a moderating and a common-sense influence on the House of Commons. It's a great pity that there aren't a lot more Liberals there to do it.
But let me ask you, but you're both, if I may call you that, grassroots Liberals, in the sense that you don't move primarily in the metropolitan sphere. What do you think yourself about the idea of a band of Liberals joining in a coalition. Are you against that, or do you think it's a good idea?
Well, I don't think that the Liberal Party is about coalitions. It's about building a liberal society, and we want political power to do that. Now, if the other parties at long last see the light and go along the road that leads towards a liberal society, then...
Thank you very much, Mr. Jones. Sorry we're brief, but there's a lot going on tonight. Good night.
Good night.
Good night, Robin.
And of course, one of the indications that we are in a very considerable deadlock situation is the Scottish Nationalists have taken Banff up there. This is a real result. This is not like the one that we gave from the next door seat of Murray and Nairn. A little disappointment for the Liberals. In Greenock and Port Glasgow, they failed to make very much headway, and Dr. Dixon Mabon is back there.
But there was a Conservative this time. Last time it was a straight fight. That's why the Liberals had some hope of it.
But we are now, I think, in a situation where it's going to be very hard indeed for any or either of the major parties to break out of the deadlock, or indeed for the Liberals perhaps to make much headway. We have not yet heard from Northern Ireland, but we are able to say that the Nationalists are making considerable headway in both Wales and Scotland. And this is the situation at this time, just coming up 5 minutes to 3. And with that situation, heading towards deadlock, which is quite a serious situation, and we have, in fact, the victor at Brentford and Isleworth. This is Mr. Barney Hayhoe. One of the slogans in the campaign was "Give Hayhoe the heave-ho," but in fact he held on to it, and in fact Brian Ash is talking to him now.
Well, Barney Hayhoe, you kept us in suspense here with your declaration, but now that we've heard the result, what's your reaction?
Obviously delighted. The count was done slowly and took a long time, but clearly delighted by this result. I think most people who have followed this campaign have had, I think, a sympathy for both the MPs who were involved in it. Both of us have been good constituency members, and I found across party divisions there was really a genuine feeling of what a pity it was that in this constituency one or other of us had to lose. Well, obviously I'm very glad that I was the lucky one to win, and my supporters have done a magnificent job in getting this result for me tonight.
Do you feel any regret at the fact that you've had to do it at the expense of another sitting member, Michael Barnes?
Well, no regret. I mean, this is the democratic process. Alas, it was the vagaries of the Boundary Commission that drew the new constituency so that we two sitting MPs really had to fight each other. Neither of us were prepared to run away and find somewhere else. Both of us really were loyal to our constituents, and so we had this contest.
Fine. Barney Hayhoe, thank you very much indeed. Congratulations.
Thank you very much.
Well, there's Barney Hayhoe, the victor in that very tightly fought seat there in West London. Michael Barnes, a pro-European Labour member who held on by the skin of his teeth last time, goes down this time. And now for some more news, Bob Mackenzie.
Here again is the home counties and the London area, which we look at separately. Conservatives have held 26 of their seats in this very important area of the country. Labour have gained 2, still just 2, Gravesend and Luton East. The Liberals have made no headway at all in way of capturing seats, and indeed have lost one of the London ones. Now this I think is really quite surprising, a point I made earlier but I think it's worth thinking about again, that all the speculation about the effect of the commuter strike has come to almost nothing. And that would seem to me to be perhaps the most surprising aspect of the home counties and commuter belt around London. If you look at the actual changes that have been occurring, Labour has held all its seats that might have been at risk, Eton and Slough, Luton West, Basildon, Watford and so on, and they've picked up Gravesend and Luton East as we noted. The Conservatives have held Oxford after a recount. We haven't heard yet from Robert Maxwell's effort to take it back for Labour. And the Conservatives have also held Dover and Deal, which was one of the ones that could have been very much in the balance right through. But that kind of swing, pushing the Conservatives up this way, has resulted in that situation in the home counties. If we now look at Greater London, the situation, Conservatives have made no gains, have held 29 seats. Labour have held 46 and picked up 4. Again, no Liberal gains in that area. This, I think, in a way is surprising because much of their strength had been concentrated in places like Richmond. They didn't manage to take. Sutton and Cheam, and so on. And of course, some famous names, Bob Carr's back at Carshalton, and then a whole list of famous Labour names have been returned. Douglas Jay, the great anti-common market figure, Ian McCardo, left-wing leader, Joan Lester at Eton and Slough, who may well be in a possible Labour government, John Silken, Robert Mellish, Peter Shore, the leading crusader against the common market, John Fraser, and so on. These are back in the London area or the southeast. The turnover of seats is fairly well, as one might have expected, granted a Labour swing of 3%, holding all their marginals. Haven't yet heard from Paddington. Conservatives, surprisingly in a way, getting Upminster. Labour taking Lewisham West, Conservatives holding Hampstead, and then a rash of Labour gains, Ealing North, Ilford South, Battersea South, and so on. And then, of course, there are the Liberal hopes that they might have had in this home counties and Greater London area, and as you see, the ones the Liberals most hope to get have been tending to go Conservative. The blue check mark is an indication they've been picked up by the Conservatives in all those places, and really grave disappointments. Orpington, for example, which heralded the great Liberal revival. They had, in one sense, bad luck. They've got a lot of votes. They've tended to be in the wrong places. That's been the story of the Liberal difficulty tonight. They've, of course, now have 5 seats and have 4 gains, so they may well come back at 15 seats, but a tiny representation for a vast public support, which is another comment on their case for changing our electoral system. They would have held the balance of power after every election since the war, including this one, if we had a European system of proportional representation. Alistair.
That was a party political broadcast on behalf of the Robert Mackenzie Proportional Representation Society. Let's see some results. Here we are. Mr. William Shelton taking Streatham there. He was an MP for Clapham.
Very big swing in Streatham. The rest near the London average of 2%. 2.1 in London. Swing to left.
And some more come up.
Swing to the Conservatives in Harrow East. A marginal the Conservatives might have helped for. Mr. Pavitt back again, but a swing to the Conservatives there.
Well, Hugh Dykes is quite a strong young candidate in Harrow East.
If the candidates matter and go to London.
And there's Rhodes Boyson, the controversial, I suppose one must say, Conservative schoolmaster, Highbury Grove Comprehensive School, taking that Brent North seat, inheriting
remarkably uniform swings in this London area. Liberals getting 20% of the vote about in those. This is a remarkable Conservative victory. 5% swing to Labour, but it is one of those seats that you might have expected the Conservatives to be under threat. It's just in Powell country, yes. 5%, way above the national average, but below the black country average.
Well, he must have something that other black country Conservatives don't appear to have. And here in Rugby, well, there's a perennial man who holds on against the swing, but this time he's put his majority up quite substantially.
But he's actually below the swing for his area of the country. Last time he had the most exceptional swing of 3% swing to Labour, right against the tide, the biggest swing to Labour in the 1970 election. Now he's just returned to normal, perhaps.
Well, it's that kind of election, isn't it?
Liberal only just saves his deposit there. I don't think they've lost a deposit in England yet.
And here's Newcastle on the line.
A marginal seat that is no longer marginal. Turnout up 18% from the Wakes week last time when it cut the turnout.
And with the Conservative Labour lead over the Conservative, or the Conservative deficit against Labour 81, with 232 results to come. That is the situation. Still in deadlock, but still some possibilities of some party trying to break out.
There is Pat Hornsby-Smith out.
And she might have held the seat if she'd stayed down in the southeast.
Yes, all those seats there were held. Sidcup and Bexley Heath and Chislehurst.
Well, now, of course, with the Labour majority over Conservatives of 10, with the Liberals in the field, although not picking up as many as they might have liked, but with the Nationalists taking seats and Northern Ireland yet to hear from, it's awfully hard, I think, to see how anybody can really break out, even given that we have the whole of day 2 to come. Graham.
Yes, the computer has now got over 400 results in. The predictions have stayed very stable, but the uncertainty has diminished. And we are now, from the computer, almost certain that neither Conservative nor Labour will get enough seats to have the overall 318. Accordingly, the Liberals and other parties are almost certain, according to the computer at this stage, to be holding the balance in the middle.
We've got another 40 seats to hear from tonight, but virtually none of them are targets. virtually none of them are targets. Bristol North West we haven't heard from. We've had a pre-poll which suggests the Conservatives would hold it. Aberdeen South we haven't heard from. Croydon Central we haven't heard from. Those, and Peterborough, where there are recounts going on, a third recount. Those are the only seats to come in tonight which the Labour Party has any hope of winning. The Labour Party has so far won a net 24 seats. They need 34 to win. And in fact, there are 5 seats to come tomorrow, to count tomorrow, which are their targets, perhaps 6 or 7. I just cannot see the seats they could win now that are still to come.
Well, now, David, we've really said from the beginning, you said from the start, even given straw polls, and they've turned out right at Watford and elsewhere, said from the start that this was looking like very close to a deadlock election. You say it's very difficult to see anybody breaking out from it now. There's Reg Prentice back in Newham North East. We wait to see Vanessa Redgrave's result there. But surely, although Bob Mackenzie is saying that Britain has got to get used to minority governments, would you not agree that the instinct of most of Britain's politicians will be to try again?
I think so, but they won't want the blame of trying again, and they will want moderation. I'm sure that this is the message of this election, and they'll all try and be moderate and cooperative and reasonable, but it's going to be a very interesting and very different sort of politics we're going to see.
Well, it's a nice question what moderation means, because what moderation means inside Britain could in fact create an economic crisis for Britain outside.
Well, strong government. I mean, the test is going to be how you settle a miners' strike in the next 2 weeks before the coal runs out.
Well, this is therefore, I think, although all elections are amusing and entertaining, in my own mind, I must say, given that here is a situation where the Liberals are holding the balance at the moment, but where in fact the balance could also be held by nationalists, by Ulster Unionists who are dissatisfied with the settlement there and the executive there, this is possibly one of the more serious crises that this country has faced.
I feel that very much. I don't accept the Bob Mackenzie party political for coalition government. I think it may be quite right if you've got time to learn the arts of coalition government, but it isn't an easy art, and it's not one you want to learn in a crisis where the country is, in some people's phrases, bleeding to death.
All I'm saying is most other countries in these circumstances either operate perfectly straightforward minority governments with no panic, or negotiate perfectly sensible coalitions.
Yes, but it will take time to learn those arts. I'm quite in favour of coalition government. It just takes time to learn, and we haven't got the time.
We mustn't make absolutely clear that there's a majority against coalition government in this studio, Bob, but I must say that in the first past-the-post electoral system, such a government is unusual outside Canada.
Well, yes, but what at least is done ordinarily is to make a clear understanding with the third party to ensure their support for a period of years. In other words, where Ramsay MacDonald went wholly wrong was trusting to the Liberals to support him and sustain him without making a clear understanding as to the basis of that support. Well, that's clear-headed minority government.
But one of the thoughts in Mr. Heath's head tonight and Mr. Wilson's head tonight is that we know the Liberals would like an alliance if the other two parties, or whichever one they were going in with, would accept proportional representation. Now, do you think that's going to be the sticking point for the Liberals in such a situation?
Well, I'd be surprised if the slightest chance of either of the two big parties agreeing to that, simply because we would always have the Liberals in the balance of power in practically every election, including this one, and that, just as in Germany, the Liberals have the balance of power and decide which of the big parties will rule. And this
it's
would
not clear that Liberals will be the biggest second, third party. It may be quite possible that the others, the nationalists of various sorts, will be a larger force in the next Parliament. The Liberals, on the present projection, 15 seats, is not a bargaining point in a balance of power situation.
All right, and I must actually also add that one of the points of the bargaining is the phrase, it is, after all, Scotland's oil. Well, let's look at some results. Here's Newham North East Reg Prentice's seat. We saw him earlier tonight, and Miss Redgrave losing her deposit.
1.7% of the vote for the most decorative of workers' candidates.
And now here's Aldridge Brownhill's Miss Dame Pat Horns, Miss Smith, we must call her now, a long battling career, and here's, I'm afraid, a defeat in it.
Succumb to the Black Country swing.
And now Robin Day is talking to Mr. Patrick Jenkin.
Mr. Patrick Jenkin, Minister for Energy. We've heard a lot of statements coming from our academic friends up there, so perhaps you can bring us down to earth a bit. First of all, David Butler says the coal stocks are going to run out in 2 weeks. Is there any truth in that?
Well, whoever is going to be responsible for this, and it all seems to me to play for the moment, will know that because we have in fact been very carefully husbanding our resources, we have rather longer than that.
The coal stocks won't get to danger point until about April, am I right?
Well, I won't predict a particular time because it depends on so many uncertainties. But
Yes.
it's rather more than the 2 weeks that David Butler mentioned.
What do you think of Robert Mackenzie's enthusiasm for coalitions that everybody else seems to have? He keeps telling us all night long.
I can't think that many people are going to be very enthusiastic about this. We warned the electorate of the danger of landing us in a coalition situation.
Yes.
And it looks as if people may not have taken these warnings very seriously, and we may have to find ourselves in something like
Of course,
that.
it could be that the British people, in their wisdom or unwisdom, have said to themselves, we want a situation where the two parties or the three parties have got to cooperate. Now, whether you like that or not, that may be the verdict of the electorate.
Well, as somebody was saying over there, this is a situation which we're not very experienced at dealing with.
We've got to deal with it now, haven't we?
Well, we have had, fortunately, fairly strong governments. They may have had small overall majorities, but we have in fact been able to carry on with single-party government. Now, if there is going to be a question of a coalition, well, all the questions of deals and wheeling and dealing is going to have to come up. And I think this is something which the electorate are not really going to like very much because it makes for weak government.
Another thing which is going to come up is this. You see that we've got 413 results. The Liberals have got 5 seats. Labour 243 and Conservatives 160. And if you look at the number of votes down there, the Liberals have got 3,600,000 votes with 5 seats so far. They've got half the number of votes of the other two parties, roughly. And the other two parties have got 160 and 243 seats. Now, a lot of people are going to say that doesn't make sense.
Well, they may say that, but the fact is that our Constitution has been based on the principle of winner takes all. And if we're going to start mucking about with it in order to try to produce the sort of arithmetical results which I think your question implies, we're going to have a very different constitutional setup. We're going to have something that looks much more like a number of countries on the Commonwealth, on the continent, whose political systems haven't always produced the most satisfactory results. I mean, it isn't in fact wholly fortuitous that the French Constitution has moved much nearer ours because they found over a period of years that something that was intended to produce results proportional to the votes cast produced a series of weak governments which got the country into great difficulty.
Thank you very much, Patrick Jenkins, Minister for Energy, for the time being at least.
Thank you.
Let's have a look at some of the results which have been piling up and our computer is processing for us.
Derby South is a good swing for Labour. The swing was big enough to save Philip Whitehead in Derby North. Derby South should have been safe Labour anyway. Huddersfield West is a very important one. They held on after a recount there. Well, I don't know really why there's a recount, 600 majority.
And here's 3 more, all Labour majorities. I don't think anybody really expected them to go. Glasgow Kelvin Grove is pretty well a merger with the Orange from North Kensington.
Here's Glasgow Govan, and that's the defeat of Mrs MacDonald, the Scottish nationalist candidate. She lost by 543 votes. She'd won the previous time by a similar amount.
And in Glasgow Pollock, a marginal seat, an opinion poll had even going slightly towards the Conservatives, but Labour has held it.
A big swing to Labour, because in fact in Scotland as a whole there's a swing to the Conservatives.
And here we have 3 more seats. In fact, no great surprise
Well,
there.
it is actually a great surprise in Dover and Deal, one of Labour's target seats. They needed to win a swing to the Conservatives of 2.5% in a seat with quite a lot of minors. And Pentland's another seat that was possible, a 2.5% swing to the Conservatives.
Liberals must have failed there. Mr Cronin was very marginal and he remains marginal.
The swing, in fact, was very much lower than the average for the Midlands, even the East Midlands. Enfield North was a Liberal hope, and it's not gone. Reading North, that really ought to have been Conservative on the redistribution, and it is. I look for Reading South still. A seat that actually has given the Liberals 22,000 votes on every election for 5 times, but it's not enough. The Liberals went down more than the Conservatives, and the Conservatives are comfortably in because, among other things, the Labour Party pushed up its vote but still lost its deposit. Pushed up by 4%, but still lost its deposit. 86% turnout there. Another Birmingham seat, firmly Conservative, with a 3% swing, a 1.5% swing to the Labour Party.
And there we have a former Minister of Sport, potential Chancellor, and perhaps the outgoing Chancellor. Well, there we are. That was quite breathless. So let's see now how the situation is going. And Michael Steed is going to tell us about the effect of the boundary changes on the election so far.
Well, I don't think there's any doubt that the Conservatives have gained from the boundary changes, and it looks as if in this very close result it may be that the boundary changes were quite decisive. We've been doing a very quick calculation, and I reckon that at the moment Labour is about 6 or 7 seats below what they would have got on the old boundaries, and the Conservatives as much as 12 or 13 seats up. There are, of course, 5 new seats in the new Parliament. However, when you look at the members of Parliament affected, the effects seem to be the other way round. There are quite a few Conservative members of Parliament, such as Harold Sorrif in Ormskirk, John Wilkinson in West Bradford, Geoffrey Stewart-Smith in Belper, all of whom have lost their seats solely because of boundary changes. All those 3 would certainly have held them but for the new boundaries. On the other side, there is a remarkable group of Labour MPs who ought to have lost their seats on boundary changes. Conservatives are again very East Lothian, I see. That's John McIntosh
John McIntosh out, yes.
Well, he's lost it. He'd had a very good swing last time. Perhaps he then had a personal vote.
It's the first straight Conservative gain of the night. A Conservative gain from Labour in a straightforward span.
Maybe Viscount Ancram has taken that. He's the son of the Marquess of Lothian.
Anyway, what is very interesting, though, is that certain other Labour MPs seem to have built up personal votes and been able to hold on to redistributed seats that I didn't expect them to. Philip Whitehead in North Derby, Judith Hart in Lanark, Frank Judd in North Portsmouth, and most remarkable of all in a way, David Owen defeating Dame Joan Vickers in Plymouth. All those looked like personal triumphs of the night.
Well, there have been some very interesting results, and we're just getting news that Mr. William Ross, former Secretary of State for Scotland, has held his seat in Kilmarnock. I wonder whether Mr. Ross really expects to be the next Secretary of State, but more important for Labour, they've held Renfrewshire West. That was one which the Conservatives might have picked up had there been a real push their way. I've made a mistake there in actually calling him the Viscount Ancram. He's the Earl of Ancram, but he is still the younger son of the Marquess of Lothian.
Elder son, I think.
Elder son, I beg your pardon, the Marquess. I'll get that right later. Now, Labour hold Glasgow Proven, and let's have a look at some more results. Rochester and Chatham, Peggy Fenner really sweated down there, but she's held on. Chris Chataway, of course, the Minister for Industry. And
Liberal
Richmond,
coming second there, very handsomely. Labour only just saving their deposit.
And Richmond, a Liberal failure.
Liberal down by quite a large margin there, 11% short of, 9% short of a victory in a seat they hoped for.
And here's Roy Jenkins's result there, and also Peter Walker's. Ian Mercado in a new seat.
Worcester is not far from the Black Country. I suppose Peter Walker can be pleased to keep the swing down to 2%.
And there's Mr. Patrick Jenkin, whom we were just speaking to. Mr. Bob Mellish should have a real job, because if he was going to hold the Labour Party together as Chief Whip or Leader of the Commons.
Why did Mr. Heath leave Bexley Heath? That was his own seat, and he still would have won it by 3,800, or if he'd been there, perhaps by a little more.
Well, Cyril Townsend, the former soldier. And here we have Mrs. Jill Knight, one of the controversial Conservatives in the campaign. Not as high a swing against her as in some other seats.
That's about the biggest majority we've seen tonight in Sheffield Park. Lord Balneil back, but just.
And here we have another collection. Christopher Mayhew in Woolwich East, Tom Boardman, who was in charge of fuel, and Peter Shaw.
That's a surprisingly narrow margin in Leicester South. It was thought to be a safe seat.
And here we have 3 more seats. No particular surprise there, I think.
The Catholic Mr. Cohen wins very comfortably in Leeds South East.
And here's Patrick Duffy, of course. So we haven't heard from the Colne Valley tonight. He was the member for the Colne Valley till he was defeated by Richard Wainwright.
But average swings there. Yorkshire as a whole is a 1.3 swing. There was a bit above it. And there again, Yorkshire seats and Huddersfield East, a slightly bigger swing than Huddersfield West, which stayed a super marginal almost. It had a recount this time as it did last time.
And there we have some more seats over on the other side of the Pennines. Mr. Alistair Goodlad succeeding to Sir John Foster in North.
Manchester-Withington is the only Conservative seat left in Manchester now that Moss Side has joined the Labour ranks.
Fred Sylvester, who's transferred from Walthamstow.
And the Liberals coming third in that Liverpool seat.
Well, those are some safe seats there, particularly Fylde North and Crosby.
Slightly wider scatter of swing, though West Houghton, of course, had a by-election which might affect the picture.
Now we're going over to the northeast.
And they're all lower swings, and a swing in Darlington actually to the Conservatives. Liberals getting 22% of the vote there. And National Front are getting 4% in South Shields.
Staying in the northeast, and again these are seats one would have expected to go that way.
The swing in Sunderland South, once a Conservative seat, a swing of 1% to the Conservatives. Mr. Bager's still very comfortably back.
And here we are now in East Anglia.
Well, David Ennals was a member for Dover till 1970. There he is back again. Cambridge, no great change.
And Mr. Tony Buck, the protector of the oyster and also a Navy minister, up to now. And here we are down in the West Country. Arthur Palmer, of course, they're very concerned with science and technology, and of course the Concorde very much an issue in Bristol. Still waiting to hear from Tony Benn.
I'm sure that means that Tony Benn must be back quite comfortably, though in fact northeast the swing is, if our figures were right, a swing to the Conservatives.
Well now, I think this is an opportunity for Bob Mackenzie to go over that much fought-over battleground and to pick out some of the salients.
Well, the victors and vanquished are all over the battleground now. Remember we said earlier that if there had been any real swing to the Conservatives, these are the kinds of seats that Labour would have lost. In fact, they've been holding all of them in those very marginal columns. On the other hand, once the swing began to Labour across the top line there and moved over to almost 2%, then we expected Labour, with crosses here, to be picking up these Conservative marginals. Some surprising successes by the Conservatives in holding their position in these marginals, the check mark, but you can see the extent to which Labour has bitten in, and then in a very important way, they've bitten in more than their swing would appear to have justified by taking places like Ilford South, Birmingham Handsworth, Leicester East, and so on. So we've had that quite striking development of a battleground that's been fought over all the way, but Labour leaping forward this way sometimes, Conservatives holding unexpectedly there. Then when we look at the Liberal hopes, it's a sad tale. They've got 5 so far: Rochdale, Isle of Wight, Devon North, Hazel Grove, and Cardigan, with almost half as many votes as either of the two big parties. They're ending up with 5 seats against 165 for Conservatives, 247 for Labour. No one needs to say anything more than this is an ironical result that couldn't happen in hardly, I think, any other European country. It could happen in Commonwealth countries. That's all. It's not a case one way or the other, just pointing out a fact. Alistair.
Well, I think a number of these facts will be pointed out, and I don't doubt argued over inside the Conservative Party over the weekend. Mr. Heath called the election. He seemed to get off to a good start in it, and indeed he entered polling day with a good lead in the opinion polls. Now the question is, will he be blamed for this result? Should he in fact have gone earlier, as perhaps some members in the organisation of the Conservative Party wanted him to go? Or will the very narrowness of the result and the possibility that there may have to be another general election, or indeed supposing that Labour formed a minority government with Liberal support, didn't do very well, will the Conservatives then immediately start picking up by-election successes? So the whole future of Mr. Heath is in the balance tonight, as indeed is Mr. Wilson. And Mr. Wilson, I think all the party leaders are pretty tired men after what has happened in the course of the campaign. We've seen them tonight. Mr. Wilson must need a little time, I think, to make some judgment about how he will behave if this deadlock situation persists. So indeed must Mr. Thorpe. But all the while, and indeed even before the weekend, we may see movements on the financial markets, the strength of the pound, problems of investment in Britain beginning to loom up. And I begin to wonder whether, although this may be the result that the British public has wished not to have any party in power, to try to get them together, perhaps even to have a grand coalition, whether this is not perhaps the worst result that the night could have brought.
I
tend to share your view, except that I'm quite sure in the Conservative post-mortems that I know who will be blamed for the result of this election. There is a man whose influence in the West Midlands has produced 11 Conservative losses there. There is no other region of the country where anything like that has happened. 5 losses in the North West and 4 losses in Greater London, but 11 losses in the West Midlands, very much centred in Powell country.
Well, that will not be forgotten in the coming weeks and months, and the computer is giving us these results, and I think it's time that we went through as many of them as we can now while we're waiting for these very late declarations tonight. Still counting, of course, in Peterborough. They may go on counting through tomorrow and Saturday, the way they're going. Let's look at some. Here we are. Mr. Lawrence is a new member, succeeding Mr. John Jennings.
Rather low swing for a Midland seat, and Stoke is weeks.
Mr. Evelyn King in Dorset South, Mr. Julian Amery in Brighton Pavilion, and Mr. Bonner Pink, former Lord Mayor of Portsmouth.
All very low swings, and the swing, in fact, to Labour in Dorset South.
And here we are in Scotland. Mr. Fletcher, of course, held that seat at a by-election. Glasgow Garskadden is a new seat out west, but Mr. Small is the
only
old
just
member.
saving its deposit. That's interesting. And Glasgow Garskadden, 21.8% for the Nationalist.
And 3 very familiar faces in Scotland there. Mr. Bruce Millen, who might have been tipped to be Secretary of State for Scotland if there were a Labour government.
Lost deposit in Hillhead for the Nationalists, just saved in Edinburgh South, 17.9% for the Nationalists in Glasgow Craigton.
And now let's go west to Wales and the West Country.
And here you see the swings, 2 swings to the Conservatives in Aberavon. If it's me who talk about swing there, Plaid Cymru only at 12.2, lost deposit. And Bristol North East, the swing again slightly to the Conservatives, not in Wales this one, slightly to the Conservatives if our calculations are right.
And 3 well-known MPs, David Walder, Mark Carlisle, who's Junior Minister of the Home Office, and Edmund Dell.
I've just had a flash that Croydon Central, one of the few seats that Labour might have hoped to win on the one still to come tonight, is in Conservative hands.
Well, that's a bit of a shift round, isn't it? In fact, David was formerly Croydon South, Richard Thompson's seat, and John Moore has held it. He's an investment banker and stockbroker for the Conservatives. Well, now, one of the losers tonight is Mrs. Margot MacDonald, who took govern in that most exceptional by-election, and Robin Day is talking to her down the line to Glasgow.
Good morning, Mrs. MacDonald.
Morning.
You must be unhappy about your own result, but pleased about the ones in Banff and Dundee.
Oh, delighted about them. A bit sad about my own because I had built up a tremendous number of personal contacts inside the constituency in quite a short time. And so I think it's sadness more than disappointment, really, because I'm quite a political person and I recognise political realities, and for our party to have come from nothing to making Govan, which was a very, very safe Labour seat, a very marginal seat, in 4 months is quite an achievement.
And how do you think the Scottish nationalist picture is looking now for the rest of the results to come in?
Rosy. I think it looks great. We said we were going to double our vote, and I hear that we're probably going to treble it.
Well, which other seats are you going to get? Would you like to make a forecast?
Well, no, I don't think I'd be too good at forecasting
No.
which seats we're going to win. I think I'd be content with the total vote, because I think that our effect on the new Parliament will be as strong because of our total vote as it is because of the number of MPs we have elected.
Will your children be pleased that you're not a member of Parliament any longer?
Well, yes, but I think they took it a bit personally. They were a bit annoyed that anyone might vote against me.
Well, you look very happy in spite of your disappointment, and thank you for talking to us.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
And of course, it seems to be the fate of nationalists in Scotland up to now that they lose a seat quickly. Remember, Dr. McIntyre won Motherwell at the end of the war, and he lost it almost within 2 months, and Mrs. MacDonald has suffered the same fate. I must stop one moment to tell a small anecdote. Mr. Harry Selby, who did very badly in the by-election, in fact, in losing the seat and was blamed for it, he again fought it again, and he won. He's a barber, he's a hairdresser. They used to tell a story in Glasgow of Jimmy Maxton, who was the ILP member, very left-wing, and he used to make great speeches attacking the seriousness of the situation of the unemployed, but he had great flowing locks. And when he said, and it's disgraceful about the unemployed, the man shouted at the back, "Aye, aye, Jimmy," and every second one of them a barber. Well, Mr. Selby, the barber, is back in Glasgow Govan. I've no doubt the Labour Party is very proud of him locally. Let's see some more results.
A recount at Carmarthen. And that's the last Welsh nationalist seat. Liberal, Labour, Welsh nationalist. Which is the challenger there?
Gwyn for Evans.
Tantalised.
All right. Well, we've been talking about how the Welsh nationalists have got on tonight, as well as the Scottish nationalists. So let's go down to Cardiff now and to hear a report from the spot.
Hello. Well, sorry we can't see you at this point. It is St David's Day, and for the first time ever at a general election, Wales has elected not just one, but two Plaid Cymru MPs. In two seats in North Wales, Meirionydd and Carnarvon, the Plaid Cymru candidates have pulled off famous victories. And here now is the party's General Secretary, Mr David Williams. We've just heard, Mr David Williams, that at Carmarthen there's a recount. It might yet be 3 seats.
Well, let us wait and see. But certainly already we have scored a tremendous historic victory. And I think this shows clearly that the people of Wales want to control more of their own affairs, and that whatever government is returned to power in London must acknowledge the need to implement the plan by the Kilbrandon Royal Commission to get a Welsh Parliament so that we can start to take control of our own country.
The chairman of the party is here as well, Dr Phil Williams. I can tell you now, I don't know who the candidates concerned are, but in the recount at Carmarthen there is 10 votes. There are, I should say, 10 votes in it between the two candidates, so it's obviously very, very close. Is this the sort of breakthrough that you have been working for, chairman of the party?
Oh, indeed. Last election we had a very, very large vote compared with our previous performance, but we didn't win any seats. This time we've won seats in Parliament. We've already won 2 with outstanding MPs now, young MPs. David Wigley and David Ellis-Thomas will make a tremendous impact in Parliament. And of course, we're now crossing our fingers that in Carmarthen, Gwynfor Evans, whom I regard as the outstanding Welshman of our time, will return to Parliament.
Well, as I say, there's 10 votes in it down there, and they're recounting. There is another possibility, of course, if the other parties are so poised at the end of this that there's a knife edge between them. Plaid Cymru might have not just its first member of Parliament, but its first Prime Minister. No, to which side are you likely to lean? Presumably the Labour side, is that right?
Yes, I think no Plaid Cymru MP could support a Tory government which had been very, very heavily rejected by the electorate of Wales, not just this election, but every election for 100 years.
Well, gentlemen, thank you very much. Now we hand back to London.
So that's the latest news from Wales, with the Plaid Cymru hope still high in Carmarthen. You notice there, of course, that Peterborough has decided to call it tonight. After 4 recounts, Sir Harmer Nichols, who is jolly used to winning in that sort of situation, is back again. And Mr Michael Ward, who is now, I'm afraid, getting used to losing in that situation, has lost again. So there ain't no justice if you like to see it going that way. However,
He's
Conservatives...
lost after 11 recounts, he's suffered in that place now.
That must be something of a record, I suppose. Anyway, Conservative in Bromsgrove and Redditch. Let's look at some more results, and here's one that the Conservatives have actually had as a straight gain. The Earl of Ancram taking Berwick and East Lothian from Mr John McIntosh.
The only straight gain of the night. John McIntosh held on against the odds last time, and he's lost this time.
And here we have television corporations and companies. Sir John Edenbach, of course, in Bournemouth West. Mr Jack Ashley, whose deafness has been, of course, very interesting to so many people, holding on in Stoke-on-Trent South very easily.
Surprising the swing isn't bigger in Stoke, because it was the Wakes week last time, cutting into the Labour vote.
And there we have Mr John Stonehouse, a former Postmaster General.
This is West Midlands, and it's surprisingly low swings by what we've learnt to judge by so far. In the Midlands as a whole, the swing is 3.7, but in the West Midlands, it's a good deal above that.
Here's a mixed bag, but that's Mr Callaghan, the Labour Party Treasurer back, and Mr Teddy Taylor, who's one of the smarter of the young Scottish Conservatives.
He was thought to be under some threat in Cathcart, but he's held it off quite comfortably.
And here we are now around London again in the home counties. Mr Humphrey Atkins, the Conservative whip back, of course, in Spelthorne, but he may have a busy time in a situation of minority government.
The Liberals came third in South Hertfordshire, was one of their hopes.
Going north to Scotland again, Glasgow Queen's Park used to be called Glasgow Gorbals.
Low swings in those 2 Edinburgh seats. A big swing to Labour, much the biggest we've had from Scotland in Glasgow Queen's Park.
Well, there we are, more results in, and a few more new results still to come in tonight, getting up to 3:30, but every result matters now in a situation if either of the main parties, and that's probably Labour, tries to break out of this deadlock situation. Let's look at the state of the parties now. And there we are. The Conservatives are 170, and on that they have 31 net losses so far tonight. Labour 249, and that means that they have 22 net gains tonight. The Liberals 5, 4 of them gains. Others 5, all 5 of them gains. Situation of deadlock, but let us see what the prediction is at the moment. The Labour lead over the Conservatives at the moment is 79. The results to come, 206, and we predict the Liberals holding the balance. That is the result that we are predicting from the computer after that number of results. Let's go to Trafalgar Square. I presume they're all still awake there and happy. And Desmond Wilcox.
Well, I don't know how dismal the prospect may seem to the party leaders at the moment. It seems pretty dismal here in Trafalgar Square, and the best suggestion that's come out so far is that we call it a score draw and have a replay at Aston Villa next Wednesday. But let's see what some of the rain-soaked long-term people, I'm handling more people than Bruce Forsyth on this show, if it does seem to be a stalemated situation and minority government, is that a good or bad thing in your opinion?
I think it could be a good thing, because it means that in fact, for once, the extremists have been defeated on both sides. And I see no bad thing. They call this election against extremism, for moderation, and if the Liberals hold the balance of power, that is truly a moderation line. The only conciliatory line I think we can hope for at this moment.
What do you say then to the argument that so desperate is the situation of the country that extreme measures are needed, and that the government is now, whichever government it is not going to be in a strong enough position to do extreme things?
Well, first, you say that extreme measures are needed. I wonder, is that hypothesis right? Do we need extreme measures? And I think no.
Right you are. Thank you very much indeed. As we get wetter and more doubtful about the outcome, except on the weather, which we know all about, from Trafalgar Square, Desmond Wilcox, back to Alistair Burnett in the studio.
Well, Desmond, we're sorry about that. It's a fairly occluded front here in a cephalogical way, but at least we're seeing it here in the warmth. Labour hold Pontypridd. Well, not too surprised about that. Now then, Bob.
I just wanted to draw your attention to a very interesting fact, that the swingometer was retired at the beginning of the evening in favour of the very expensive computer. Now, if you look back to what was said then, we said that if there's a 1% swing to Labour, you still have a slight Conservative lead, perhaps not enough to handle the 30 Liberals we were assuming then, and others, Liberals and others. We said if you then assume an almost 2% Conservative lead, swing to Labour, which is exactly what we've had, you then had a position with Labour ahead, but the Liberals and others holding the balance of power. So this little machine had it all right all the way through.
Can you come back next week when we may have another general election, which will give you an equal opportunity to see how it goes?
At no expense, it predicted very accurately.
But, Bob, under proportional representation, does a swingometer work?
No, you need a totally different thing then.
Well, it's very honest of me to admit that. Well, we've had this very scurrilous and very strong attack indeed upon the computer, which I think has, once it settled down very early on, has been telling us precisely what was going to happen tonight. And I think this, after, no offence, naturally not at this time in the morning. Graham, what is the computer saying to you, and what does it say to you about Bob Mackenzie?
Well, it's saying to me that the predictions are very much as they've been for quite a while now. The Labour majority over Conservative is predicted at 11, and the probability that Liberals and other parties would hold the middle gets more and more sure. So, unless there are some surprises tomorrow, I think that is the conclusion of all the analysis that the computer has been doing tonight. David?
I think the swingometer does have the limitation that Bob fully admits that it can't cope with the third-party situation fully. And it is worth, I think, very much now looking at the prospects for the third party. Now, there are seats which on the figures so far look like good. They've got 5 seats so far, the Liberals. There are 5 other seats. They have a pretty good chance, a 4 to 5 chance. North Cornwall, Montgomery, Orkney, Inverness and Roxburgh. I think Roxburgh might be dicey. So that's 10 seats. And then there are about another 5 or 7 seats they have a goodish chance in. And if you want, I'll come back on the Nationalists.
Well, I just wanted to say, David, that the Conservatives are holding 1 seat Labour might have hoped to take, Aberdeen South. We
yes,
just
that's
had a flash
certainly one of the few marginals left to come in tonight.
That's one which the Conservatives will be quite happy to hold. Well, now, when I say I want a good, clean fight, and when I say break, I mean break. Bob?
No, I agree with him on that last point. I'm simply saying it is curious, with all that wild swinging about we had in the beginning, that the simple average swing in the end was producing much the same result as the computer.
Well, I'm very happy to stop at that point of agreement. Let's see some results. Well, here we are. And
huge swing to Labour in Sheffield Hallam, though I think it's been slightly affected by redistribution. The Scottish Nationalists just saved their deposit in Glasgow Central.
Well, that's Winnie Ewing's husband. And here we are. No real surprises there, I don't think.
Big swing in Whalley West, which is again Powell country.
And Rod McFarquhar taking Belper. Of course, George Brown would have held it in 1970 if indeed Mr. Callaghan and Mr. Wilson had allowed redistribution.
We assume, though, on the figures, about a 4% swing to Labour in Belper.
Oh, it's a good result for him. And here we have Mr. William Ross, former Secretary of State back in Kilmarnock, Mr. Fred Willey in Sunderland North.
Swing to the Conservatives. I think that's the biggest swing for the Conservatives I've seen recorded tonight. And a swing to the Conservatives in Sunderland too.
And here we are now in Scotland and Wales.
And swings to the Conservatives in Edinburgh, Leith and in Gower and in Dunfermline. All of them a huge swing. That's the biggest yet in Dunfermline, though it may depend a little bit on redistribution calculations.
And here we're starting in East Kilbride. Morris Miller, who moved from central Glasgow, and there's Mr. Fowler in Sutton
He's
Coldfield.
not actually a former member. He got back. He was out in 1970. He's got back again. Oh, no, so that's Norman Fowler,
yes,
who moved from Nottingham. And Newins was back, who was there until 70, in a neighbouring area.
Oh, a lot of familiar faces. And there's Sir George Sinclair in Dorking, one of the left-wing Conservatives.
And Charlie Pannell now is succeeded by Mr. Dean for Labour, and the Liberals came second with 33% of the poll in Leeds West.
And in Barking there, Miss Jo Richardson succeeds Tom Dryburgh. She's Secretary of the Tribune Group, so that's perhaps only natural.
Liberals came second in Gillingham and in Barking and in Shoreham. All those three had Liberals second, 33% in Shoreham for the Liberals.
And there's a slight worry for the Liberals at the bottom there. Pudsey, they'd had some outside hopes of doing well there.
And they came second in all those 3 seats too. It's really remarkable. 29%, 27%, 32% for the vote in Pudsey for the Liberals.
And again there in Leeds South, Mr. Merlin Rees, who would probably be in the hot spot in Northern Ireland if Labour were to form a government.
Aberdare was one of the great hopes for Plaid Cymru. They were 30% behind the Labour Party, although they got 30% of the vote.
No surprises there, Conservatives in the home counties.
Quite a close race in Bath, which the Liberals come second. They were within 10% of winning Bath, not as close as I suggested.
And here we are, Bill Deeds back in Ashford, and Chippenham has been a Liberal hope, but Mr. Audrey has held on very carefully there, very strongly.
The Liberals went up 18% in their share of the vote. No, 10%, sorry, 10% in their share of the vote. But they were still 6% behind the Conservatives. And they were second in Wells and second in Ashford.
Well, we are just waiting now for some of the few remaining results which are to be declared tonight. Of course, a whole raft start again tomorrow. So this is an opportunity, I think, to go to the Liberal Party headquarters. They've had quite an in-and-out evening.
Bristol North West, one of the few remaining marginals, due tonight, and all the pre-polls have been justified by the result.
Well,
fairly closely.
Somebody's been right then tonight, but it's still very much a very difficult and confused situation, a situation of deadlock, which British politicians, if they haven't had a seminar from Bob Mackenzie, have now got to start to live with. Well, I was going to go to Martin Bell, who's down there at Liberal Party headquarters. Let's go over Martin Bell.
Lord Beaumont, chairman of the Liberal Party campaign committee, it now seems that the Liberals are at least likely to hold the balance of power. How are you going to play it?
Well, it won't depend upon us in the first instance. I mean, Mr. Heath is still Prime Minister until he resigns. But it seems to me that if one of the major parties, if neither of the major parties has in fact an overall majority, they've only got 3 choices. One is to try and make an arrangement with the people who hold the balance of power. The second is to trim their legislative programme and allow the people who hold the balance of power to vote on each thing according to its merits, and if necessary then the government does not necessarily resign if it's defeated on a particular issue. And I think this is probably the most attractive choice from the point of view of the country. And of course the third alternative is to call another general election, but considering that we all thought that this one wasn't necessary, I don't think that would be very popular.
Can we expect the Liberals themselves to be seeking some kind of a formal understanding?
No, it isn't for us to seek a formal understanding. I think it's for the major parties to try and decide, each one of them, or maybe both, to decide how the country is going to be governed, and we will cooperate to the fullest in anything that we consider a reasonable way of getting this country onto its feet again.
Do you welcome the situation in which a small number of Liberal MPs could hold the balance?
A small number of Liberal MPs, but a large number of Liberal votes. 20% of the electorate will have voted Liberal almost certainly by the end of this election, and I think that's a very healthy thing that they should hold the balance, yes.
Would you admit to some feeling of disappointment, even so, at the present time?
Oh, yes, very much so. We've suffered from our advantages. We thought, in a way, that our vote might be spread unevenly through the country. It's because it's been spread very evenly that we haven't had many breakthroughs in particular areas.
So do you expect these millions of Liberal votes, if not very many Liberal seats, to have some moral impact, even?
Yes, certainly. I mean, there's a lot of stubbornness in the leaders of the two other parties on this particular point. But I don't see how they can possibly ignore the fact that 20% of the electorate voted for Liberals, and that on the whole the electorate has voted for a balance of power situation.
Thank you very much indeed, Lord Bowman.
Well, it's always said that the electorate gets what it wants, and that the electorate is rather cleverer than some other people in using the electoral system to get the result that it wants. Whether this is the result that it needs, of course, remains to be seen.
That's a very mystical view of political behaviour, Alistair.
Well, it's rather early in the morning. It's getting on to be late in the morning, in fact.
Is it? Oh, yes, 4:45. Never noticed it.
Still waiting for one or two results to come in. Let's look at one or two results now.
Now, these just illustrate what Lord Beaumont has been saying. There's not enough to come second. The Liberals got 32%, 26%, 28% in these three seats. They did very well indeed by any conceivable past standards, but they didn't come near to winning any of these seats. And indeed, here's another case. St Albans, they come second. Fareham, they come second. And Sheffield, Hillsborough, not their sort of territory, they come third, but get 17% of the vote.
And some other Conservative strongholds.
And three more cases of the Liberals coming second in safe Tory seats, the Labour Party squeezed into third place.
Well, there's a mixed bag for you.
And there's a disappointment for the Liberals, Scarborough. The Liberals come second, but they don't win the seat. They're 9% behind. It was one of their major hopes, but Michael Pitts did not do any better in Scarborough this time than he did in Scarborough and Whitby last time.
Now we're going to Dumbarton Central for the declaration. Mr. Jimmy Reid of Upper Clyde Shipbuilders is a candidate.
Water Revolutionary Party.
Thomas Colin Harvey.
Liberal.
2,583. Michael William Hurst.
Conservative.
9,775. Hugh McCartney.
Labour.
16,439. James Reid.
Communist.
5,928. Andrew Peyton Welsh.
SNP.
5,906. And I declare Hugh McCartney to be duly elected to serve in Parliament.
Well, Mr. McCartney had rather a tough time in that seat. He was the sitting member for Dumbartonshire East. Mr. Reid came in. Mr. McCartney accused him of not very honest tactics. And let's hear him now while he replies to the returning officer.
Police and all these other good people who carried out the administrative work connected with this election in central Dumbartonshire. So far as our relationships as candidates with all of these people is concerned, I think we are all agreed, possibly the only point in which we will agree, that they in fact carried out their job efficiently and without any friction or frustration to the candidates and their agents.
Hear, hear.
The result...
Well, there we have rather a bitter fight which has taken place in central Dumbartonshire, and Mr. Jimmy Reid, who was the communist who had most hopes of getting in, if any communist was going to get in, has failed, in fact, rather dismally compared with some of the thoughts and some of the hopes which the Communist Party had placed in him. That's a very considerable success for Labour Party discipline.
But Jimmy Reid did just save his deposit, and with one candidate in the Ronda, they're the first two communists since 1955 to save their deposits. But it was only 14.6 of the vote. He just tied with the Scottish Nationalist.
And that's the situation at 3:48, with the Conservatives 31 net losses, Labour 22 net gains, Liberal with 5 seats, 4 of them gains, and 5 others, chiefly nationalists, but of course Dick Tavern in there as well, gains compared with 1970. Let's look at what the prediction board is saying, and after 435 results, the computer is saying a Labour majority over Conservatives of 9, but there are 14 Liberals holding the balance, and beyond them there are now several nationalists, and tomorrow we may have a number of Ulster members who are not entirely happy with either of the major parties at Westminster. Let's see some more results. And these are normally safe Conservative seats. Ray Morby, a Conservative trade unionist, Sir John Gilmer in Fife East.
Nationalists came second in Fife East, though they only got 19% of the vote. Liberals second in the other 2 seats.
And there we have...
second in Glasgow Provan, and Plaid Cymru second in Caerphilly. Phil Williams was a hope of theirs, but he's 30% behind the Labour Party. Liberals second in Louth.
Terence Higgins, of course, who's been at the Treasury during the 3.5 years of Conservative government.
Liberals second in Worthing and Maidstone. SNP second in Glasgow Springburn. Liberals second in Harwich and Bristol West. Labour second in Chester.
All familiar faces in the House of Commons. Oh, sorry, a new member in Chester. And there's Alex Wilson. Of course, he had his troubles with the Nationalists at one time.
Hamilton, this Willie Ewing's seat, 31.9% of the vote for the Nationalists, still 17% behind the Labour Party.
Well, now, Robin Day is, of course, continuously in business as the night goes on. And I think at the moment he's got Mr. Peter Shaw, who, of course, has campaigned most vigorously inside the Labour Party, particularly on the European question. Robin.
And, Mr. Shaw, how do you view the possibility, which looks increasingly likely, of a minority Labour government, depending on the Liberals and a lot of other all sorts, to keep them in power?
Well, I think I can reply to that quite simply by saying that I view the prospect of a minority Labour government less favourably than I would the prospect of a majority Labour government, but that I view the prospect of any kind of Labour government with great pleasure when compared with the existing government.
But of course, if you were trying to renegotiate the common market, the Liberals wouldn't stand for that, would they?
Well, I don't know. What precisely today are the Liberal Party's policies towards the EEC is, I think, a matter to be inquired into and perhaps debated and discussed with the Liberal leaders. I don't know.
Don't you think it's very surprising that you haven't done better, the Labour Party, in view of all the things which went for you in the campaign, the balance of payments figures and the cost of living index? Why do you think this is?
Well, I think you have to answer that question, first of all, by asking yourself why Mr. Heath had an election at all. He chose to go to the country on what he thought was an issue which he could convince the country that he had no other choice but to have an election, in which he was right. So therefore, no Prime Minister...
An answer to the question, why haven't you done better?
Well, it is in a way, isn't it? Because
well, it's another question to me.
No, but I think the answer to the question is very simply this, that when a Prime Minister goes to the country at a time of his own choice, when he doesn't have to, the assumption must be that he thinks that he's going to have the running all his way. And I think, therefore, that one must begin with that assumption and then add to it the fact that as the campaign has developed, we were able contrary to all the Prime Minister's hopes, to switch the election issues onto other grounds and to make very considerable progress.
Well, you seem to have made the pollsters look pretty foolish, if nothing else. We haven't heard much from them lately. We heard from them at the beginning of the programme. Alistair?
Well, Robin, I think perhaps we ought to say that, in fact, the polls taken today, as voters came away from the polling booths, have uniformly turned out to be correct. And that's something to be said, at least for the pollsters. I'm not a pollster, but somebody's got to speak up, I think, at this time.
And I think, actually, the final shares of the vote allocated to the parties when all the votes are in will not be more than 2 or 3% out for any one party on any of the polls.
Let's look at some more results. These are all Conservative seats.
And all ones in which the Liberals have actually managed to come second, 30%, 27%, 40%. Newbury, there's a very impressive Liberal vote there. They nearly pipped the Conservatives in Newbury.
There's 3 more.
And 3 more with the Liberals second in safe seats. Labour was challenged, but they won very, very handsomely in 28% margin in Greenock.
And 3 more? No, we haven't got any more at the moment. Just to say, you saw there the announcement that Labour has held on in Sowerby after a recount. That's Mr. Max Madden. It used to be Douglas Houghton's old seat. And of course it would have been very vulnerable had there been any Conservative shift in the country. But there wasn't. Now, Bob Mackenzie.
Well, the story of this long night began, of course, here in the home counties with the result at Guildford just after 11. It showed a tiny switch in the direction of the Conservatives and probably raised their hopes. But that was not to be. In fact, the 27 seats they picked up and lost 2, the 2 being lost to Labour, of course, at Gravesend and Luton East. The astonishing part of the story, in a way, is that the Liberals have been stronger in this home counties area at 25% than in almost any other part of the country. But with 25% of the vote, they have not been able to pick up a seat. And this is part of the story that Lord Beaumont and others referred to. They just have not had the breaks, granted the fact they've had this really quite striking support, popular support in this area. And no evidence, incidentally, of the commuter backlash that we thought might occur in that area. When you look at the seats at risk, Labour has held all the ones that would be mostly at risk for them, made the gain at Gravesend and the one at Luton East. A result to come at Buckingham, and then after the recount at Oxford, the Conservatives held it, one of the great bellwether seats in that part of the country. When you come to Greater London, again, quite surprising stability, really. The Conservatives with 32 seats they've held, and 4 they've lost to Labour only, not to the Liberals. Ealing North, Battersea South, Lewisham West, and Ilford South. Otherwise, London reigning much as it was, except, of course, that the Liberals lost their by-election victory at Sutton and Cheam. 4 seats then changing hands in the Greater London area. And they're seen here, of course, in this summary chart. These are the ones that Labour might have lost. They've held them all. Conservatives held the most marginal one of theirs, Upminster. But Labour broke through again in that way, and you can see the Conservative holding on to these top ones. That's the picture then in the south, east and in London. Alistair.
And Esther Ranson is down at Covent Garden, where people now are beginning to go to work. Esther?
Well, it's lovely at this time of night to be with people who are happy to be up and happy to be working, particularly over boxes of leeks on St David's Day. I'm not going to ask you about St David's Day, I'm going to ask you about the election. Are you pleased with the way it seems to have gone, so evenly divided between all the parties?
No, naturally, I want to see Labour get in, don't you? I do, anyway.
What do you feel, sir?
Well, I'm not English, really, and...
So you don't mind our funny little ways? What do you think, sir?
Well, I think it's irrelevant, but I think that the money will go out of the country.
Why?
Well, my daughter works for the Stock Exchange, and she was told last evening that if the Tories get in, next month they get their bonus, but if the Labour get in, they get nothing.
But as it happens, everybody's getting it a bit their own way. Isn't that a good thing?
Well, that depends on the way you look at it.
How did you vote?
Pardon?
How did you vote?
Well, I overdone it. My back aches. But if I'd have voted Labour.
What's that got to do with your back?
Have you ever tried humping a barrow? Then you know what a bad back is.
Perhaps they ought to have special facilities, do you think? Special
They should
facilities.
do, like a postal vote or something like that.
Right, for bad backs. Anyone else, sir, with an opinion? Come and talk to us, sir. What do you mean you haven't got time?
I'm busy man.
It's a very important day in the life of the country. We've had an election.
I know that.
It's been a dramatic night.
True.
The Labour have got half the votes, the Tories have got the other half, the Liberal in the middle. What do you think of that?
What can I think? Well, personally, I hope the Tories get in.
Right, sir.
I do.
Any message to Robin Day?
Not particularly.
Alistair Burnett?
No, not particularly.
Thank you very much.
All right.
Thank you.
Well, he's not committing himself, so I suppose we shouldn't, to the election winner. And at this particular time of night or early morning, we should just pick one point up here, which I don't think we've been able to give you up to now. The Conservatives actually lost one seat to Labour during the course of the last Parliament at Bromsgrove. That was a straight Labour win. Tories have got that back tonight. It's something to put on their shelf beside Sutton and Cheam. Let's see some more results. Willie Hamilton in Fife Central and Tim Sainsbury in Hope.
And the Communists lost their deposit in Willie Gallagher's old seat, only 4% of the vote. A very good Scottish Nationalist result in Galloway, 30.7% of the vote, but not enough to win. And Des Wilson doesn't get back in Hove, 20%
And
behind.
the New Forest does not follow the Isle of Wight, David.
No, the New Forest does not follow the Isle of Wight. It had an eager letter saying it was going to, but it's 18% behind, and it's certainly not near, though 14% up in the share of the vote.
There's three more, Tam Dalziel there and Walter Padley and
Mr Wolfe, who we've seen a lot of, the Scottish Nationalists, getting 35% of the vote there in West Lothian. It's an impressive vote, but he's still 10% behind Tam Dalziel. That was the first Scottish Nationalist breakthrough in the Tam Dalziel by-election in '62.
And three more Scottish seats, all pretty safely Labour.
Yes, the Liberals come nowhere, didn't even fight Paisley, which was once a stronghold. The SNP comes third with 20% there, 27% in Midlothian and 25% in Kirkcaldy.
Well, now, we saw that result in the Bartonshire Central, and Mr Jimmy Reid, the Communist, didn't do as well as by repute he was going to do, but here he is at the end of a fiery speech.
And lastly, I want to make this point. I have said very little about what's happened, particularly in the last 10 days. But I've been the victim of the most scurrilous, unprincipled attack on any candidate in Britain. And I've not reacted. I've not reacted. I've turned the other cheek, as the good book says, because I do not want to create social divisions such as exist in a stretch of water or across a stretch of water from this island here of Britain. And I want to make this point. I associate myself with all that's good in the Labour Party and the Labour movement. But I'm saying right now to Peter Allison and to Harold Wilson, there are elements in the Scottish Labour Party, in the Clydebank Labour Party, that if they were living in Spain would be supporters of Franco and members of the Falangist Party. Absolutely. That is wrong and nonsense. I will be fighting, I want to make this point, I've trebled my vote on the last election with a much bigger constituency. And I'll be fighting at the next election, and sooner or later, the left and the Labour Party and the Labour movement, and the Communist Party will unite and prove victorious. That's the only way ahead for Britain. Thank you very much.
A little difference of opinion in Dumbartonshire Central. Let's see some more results from Scotland first.
And these are ones which show very little swing, but they do show fairly not such good SNP results, Scottish National results we've heard elsewhere. 18% in Lanark, 14% in Bothwell, 15% in Ayrshire Central.
And two in the northeast and one over in Barrow. All Labour strongholds. Now let's go down to the West Country, two Flint seats and Gloucestershire South.
Well, John Cope, who's helped the Conservatives in Central Wales, is now back in Parliament, is now in Parliament for the first time.
Rear Admiral Morgan Giles, that's Mr. Harry Ewing, not a Scottish nationalist party, and
Liberals
Mr.
in
Baxter,
second place
one
in
of the more
Worcester.
silent
Now this is
Labour
SNP
members.
hopes, and Labour wins comfortably from Dr. McIntyre. 7% up in Stirling and Falkirk, 20% in the other Stirling seat we heard. Saw that.
And 2 down south and 1 in Islington.
Those are
Mr.
more
David Price, of
conventional
course, a
seats.
former Conservative junior minister.
A swing to the Labour as we calculated in Gosport. And lowish swing in Pontefract, a mining seat, only 1% to Labour. And a swing to the Conservatives in Macclesfield, but the by-election may have slightly distorted the pattern there. It's back safely. That's compared to the general election, of course, that swing. It's safely back in the Conservative column, having been a marginal by-election seat.
Nick Winterton, who had his doubts about the common market, as indeed did Mr. Powell, who perhaps has done more damage than anybody else to the Conservative cause tonight. And with the news of the Conservatives holding Perth and East Perthshire, that's Mr. Ian MacArthur. Robin.
Well, we got some of the earlier editions of the morning papers before we've got all our results, of course, but there's the Daily Express. Now it's one big seesaw. The Daily Mirror, Labour sees lead. The Times, Mr. Heath's general election gamble fails. The Guardian, Labour swings on as Tories wilt. And Financial Times taking it somberly, early trend favours Labour. Well, those are some of the things you'll see in your papers. Later editions will carry more. Now I've got our 3 journalistic friends. Mr. Jenkins of The Guardian, what are your conclusions now? And do you see a Labour minority government with Liberal support?
Well, that's how it looks, doesn't it? The Prime Minister asked the country a very silly question, and he's got a very silly answer. He asked who rules the country, and the answer would seem to be that nobody rules the country. I think this is nothing for us to make jokes about. I think the Prime Minister did a grave disservice in calling this election for the reasons that he did, because it's all very well to say that coalitions can govern and do in other countries. We have a very unstable situation here. We have a very serious economic situation, and the people have clearly said by their votes, we want moderate government of whichever party or of all parties. But they're not going to get that. They're going to get a political infight, which is going to go on for some while, producing, I would think, another election before very long.
Do you think that situation and your analysis of it behoves the Labour Party and the minority government to try and get Liberal support to give them a strong government?
I would think that the responsible thing to do for the leader of the party, which has the largest number of seats in the House of Commons, is to, by one means or another, form a government which can govern with the consent of the people. And I think that means stretching out to these probably 5 million or more Liberal voters, regardless of how few seats the Liberals actually have in the House of Commons.
Does that mean replacing Harold Wilson with somebody else
No,
who's more
not at
appealing
all.
to the Liberals?
I think that Mr. Wilson could perfectly well do this. I think that he may encounter serious difficulty in his own party if he tries to.
What do you think? Do you agree with that analysis, Anthony Howard?
I don't think I do. I think that I agree with everything that Peter said at the beginning, but I think he's leaping a fence. I think I know the Tory party, if only from outside, very much from outside, and they like power. And
I hear a lot of guffaws from Tories watching when you say you think you know them, but still go on.
I think I know them from outside, and I press my nose at the window pane and watch them. I don't think they lightly give up power, and I think it is quite within historical precedent for Mr. Heath to say the Queen's government has got to be carried on. I am still the Queen's First Minister. It is up to the House of Commons to defeat me. If they want to, then I will abide by that decision, but I do not propose to go to the palace tomorrow afternoon, Friday, and hand in my resignation.
And
Oddly enough,
he'd try and get Liberal support to keep him in power.
I think he didn't have to have support in a way if he could get enough odds and sods to vote for him to keep the government going, and I'm afraid the pound will be on the floor, below $2 tomorrow, and I think he'll have a very strong case. Let's never forget this, Robin.
I'll resist the temptation to ask you who are the odds and who are the sods, but
okay.
could Mr. Cosgrave give his brief analysis?
I suppose it's possible that Mr. Heath may go snivelling to Mr. Thorpe, but that can't disguise the fact that this general election result has been tragic for the Conservative Party. Mr. Heath has now tried to lead it in 2 different directions. One towards the free enterprise idea in 1970, and then halfway through his term towards a collectivist idea. He's failed on both counts. He's therefore failed his party as well as the country.
Are you saying that he's got to go?
I think it would probably be by far the best solution for the Conservative Party. It probably won't come immediately. He may have the kind of stubbornness that Tony Howard describes. He may insist on hanging on by his fingernails to power, but it must be a shattering blow for him personally. He is a man of exceptional willpower and exceptional commitments to his own ideas. They don't happen to have been the ideas of his party. He had a very good majority before this election. He has chosen to throw it away.
Well, we'll see what the final result is. Alistair?
And while we're waiting for that, we won't have any more tonight, I think. We're waiting for Mr. Wedgwood Benz, but it may not come in time for us, I don't think. Let's look at some more results. Miss Betty Harvey Anderson, Mr. Gregor Mackenzie, Mr. Kershaw. And here we go in the Midlands again.
Big swings in Powell country.
And here we are in London.
There's Peterborough 22, much the smallest majority tonight, like the smallest majority it was in 1966, only 3 then.
He's getting used to it, I think. And there's Jim Pryor, of course, who's been Leader of the House of Commons back. And in Sowerby, that's the Douglas Houghton seat, which Labour has held very narrowly indeed, and a swing to the Conservatives there. So, those are the results. I think it's time. This is very early morning. Sometimes in the early morning the comments begin to show that. But let's have a little analysis of how our experts have seen the election so far, starting with David.
Well, the turnout is up 8%. The Liberal share of the vote on the figures so far is up 12%. Labour is down 6%. Conservatives down 8%. If you actually do an average swing figure, it's about 2%. The country as a whole has been very even. The only ones that have deviated from the normal pattern have been the West Midlands, which have gone heavily to the Conservatives, Wales and Scotland, and the South West, which have gone went heavily to Labour, the West Midlands, and the other 3, which have gone slightly to the Conservatives. Those have deviated. 11 seats lost to the Labour Party, lost to the Conservative Party in the West Midlands, and that's where the election has been decided. There are only, in my reckoning, 11 Conservative marginal seats to come up tomorrow, and on our past form they certainly won't go. It is absolutely clear that we are not going to have a clear majority out of this election. Nothing that could happen tomorrow could give a clear majority either to the Conservatives or to the Labour Party. But we still have a good deal of uncertainty with about 10 target seats for the Liberals in areas which will probably deviate from the national pattern. So there's a great deal to watch tomorrow, and I don't know whether we'll be clear. The Queen's journey may not have been necessary because it'll take a little time to sort things out. Nobody will be rushing to the palace at 3 o'clock tomorrow afternoon as they did in 1964 and 1970.
Well, it's going to be a prolonged, but we believe interesting agony, and there could be some very interesting results still to come.
One minor casualty, the opinion polls. 24 out of 25 pointed in the direction of a Conservative victory. They've certainly got it rough tonight again, as at the last election. Beyond that, a gravely serious result. So serious, I'm convinced, in terms of the effect on Britain's international monetary position, everything else, that there may be far more possibilities of a joint action being forced upon this House of Commons than we expect.
And that's, we just saw the result there that Harold Gurdon has held Birmingham Selly-Oak very late this morning, I think we have to say. Reminded by what Bob has said of the words of C. Day Lewis about our 3 party leaders. Consider these, for we have condemned them, leaders to no sure land. Well, we'll be back at 6 o'clock in the morning with Michael Barrett and Adam Watson, and of course we'll continue the results as the day goes on. For the moment, good morning.